H.P. Lovecraft. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, August 20th, 1890 to March 15th, 1937, was an American writer of weird science, fantasy, and horror fiction. He is best known for his creation of the Cthulhu mythos. Born in Providence, Rhode Island, Lovecraft spent most of his life in New England. After his father's institutionalization in 1893, he lived affluently until his family's wealth dissipated after the death of his grandfather. Lovecraft then lived with his mother in reduced financial security until her institutionalization in 1919. He began to write essays for the United Amateur Press Association, and in 1913 wrote a critical letter to a pulp magazine that ultimately led to his involvement in pulp fiction. He became active in the speculative fiction community and was published in several pulp magazines. Lovecraft moved to New York City, marrying Sonia Green in 1924, and later became the center of a wider group of authors known as the Lovecraft Circle. They introduced him to Weird Tales, which would become his most prominent publisher. Lovecraft's time in New York took a toll on his mental state and financial conditions. He returned to Providence in 1926 and produced some of his most popular works, including The Call of Cthulhu, At the Mountains of Madness, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and The Shadow Out of Time. He would remain active as a writer for 11 years until his death from intestinal cancer at the age of 46. Lovecraft's literary corpus is based around the idea of cosmicism, which was simultaneously his personal philosophy and the main theme of his fiction. Cosmicism posits that humanity is an insignificant part of the cosmos and could be swept away at any moment. He incorporated fantasy and science fiction elements into his stories, representing the perceived fragility of anthropocentrism. This was tied to his ambivalent views on knowledge. His works were largely set in a fictionalized version of New England. Civilizational decline also plays a major role in his works, as he believed that the West was in decline during his lifetime. Lovecraft's early political opinions were conservative and traditionalist. Additionally, he held a number of racist views for much of his adult life. Following the Great Depression, Lovecraft became a socialist, no longer believing a just aristocracy would make the world more fair. Throughout his adult life, Lovecraft was never able to support himself from earnings as an author and editor. He was virtually unknown during his lifetime and was almost exclusively published in pulp magazines before his death. A scholarly revival of Lovecraft's work began in the 1970s, and he is now regarded as one of the most significant 20th century authors of supernatural horror fiction. Many direct adaptations and spiritual successors followed. Works inspired by Lovecraft, adaptations or original works, began to form the basis of the Cthulhu mythos, which utilizes Lovecraft's characters, setting, and themes. Biography: Early life and family tragedies. Lovecraft was born in his family home on August 20th, 1890, in Providence, Rhode Island. He was the only child of Winfield Scott Lovecraft and Sarah Susan née Phillips Lovecraft. Susie's family was of substantial means at the time of their marriage, as her father, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, was involved in business ventures. In April 1893, after a psychotic episode in a Chicago hotel, Winfield was committed to Butler Hospital in Providence. His medical records state that he had been doing and saying strange things at times, for a year before his commitment. The person who reported these symptoms is unknown. Winfield spent 5 years in Butler before dying in 1898. His death certificate listed the cause of death as general paresis, a term synonymous with late-stage syphilis. Throughout his life, Lovecraft maintained that his father fell into a paralytic state due to insomnia and overwork, and remained that way until his death. It is not known whether Lovecraft was simply kept ignorant of his father's illness or whether his later statements were intentionally misleading. After his father's institutionalization, Lovecraft resided in the family home with his mother, his maternal aunts Lillian and Annie, and his maternal grandparents Whipple and Roby. According to family friends, his mother, known as Susie, doted on the young Lovecraft excessively, pampering him and never letting him out of her sight. Lovecraft later recollected that his mother was permanently stricken with grief after his father's illness. Whipple became a father figure to Lovecraft in this time, Lovecraft noting that his grandfather became the center of my entire universe. Whipple, who often traveled to manage his business, maintained correspondence by letter with a young Lovecraft who, by the age of 3, was already proficient at reading and writing. Whipple encouraged the young Lovecraft to have an appreciation of literature, especially classical literature and English poetry. In his old age, he helped raise the young H.P. Lovecraft and educated him not only in the classics, but also in original weird tales of winged horrors and deep, low moaning sounds, which he created for his grandchild's entertainment. The original sources of Phillips's weird tales are unidentified. Lovecraft himself guessed that they originated from Gothic novelists like Anne Radcliffe, Matthew Lewis, and Charles Maturin. It was during this period that Lovecraft was introduced to some of his earliest literary influences, such as The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, illustrated by Gustave Doré, 1001 Nights, Thomas Bulfinch's Age of Fable, and Ovid's Metamorphosis. While there is no indication that Lovecraft was particularly close to his grandmother Roby, her death in 1896 had a profound effect on him. By his own account, it sent his family into a gloom from which it never fully recovered. His mother and aunts wore black mourning dresses that terrified him. This is also the time that Lovecraft, approximately 5.5 years old, started having nightmares that later would inform his fictional writings. Specifically, he began to have recurring nightmares of beings he referred to as night gaunts. He credited their appearance to the influence of Doré's illustrations, which would whirl me through space at a sickening rate of speed, the whole fretting and impelling me with their detestable tridents. 30 years later, night gaunts would appear in Lovecraft's fiction. Lovecraft's earliest known literary works were written at the age of 7 and were poems restyling the Odyssey and other Greco-Roman mythological stories. Lovecraft would later write that during his childhood, he was fixated on the Greco-Roman pantheon and briefly accepted them as genuine expressions of divinity, foregoing his Christian upbringing. He recalled at 5 years old being told Santa Claus did not exist and retorted by asking why God is not equally a myth. At the age of 8, he took a keen interest in the sciences, particularly astronomy and chemistry. He also examined the anatomical books that were held in the family library, which taught him the specifics of human reproduction, that were not yet explained to him. As a result, he found that it virtually killed my interest in the subject. In 1902, according to Lovecraft's later correspondence, astronomy became a guiding influence on his worldview. He began publishing the periodical Rhode Island Journal of Astronomy using the hectograph printing method. Lovecraft went in and out of elementary school repeatedly, oftentimes with home tutors making up for the lost years, missing time due to health concerns that have not been determined. The written recollections of his peers described him as withdrawn, but welcoming to those who shared his then current fascination with astronomy, inviting them to look through his prized telescope.